The autumn light, usually so generous in Reno, Nevada, felt thin and watery this October afternoon in 2000. It seeped through the living room windows of Sarah Wilson's modest home, doing little to chase away the chill that had settled deep in her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the outside temperature. At 40, Sarah's face was a landscape etched with a decade and a half of grief, each fine line around her eyes a testament to the sleepless nights and unspoken questions that had become her constant companions. She sat on the worn floral sofa, a mug of lukewarm herbal tea clutched in hands that trembled faintly. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the loudest sound in the vast emptiness of the house. 16 years, 16 autumns had come and gone since the last time she'd seen her husband David and their 8-year-old son Tommy. 16 years since they'd waved goodbye from the driveway, their blue Chevy Suburban packed for a father-son fishing trip into the High Sierras, a trip they'd promised would be the best ever. Those words, innocent and full of promise, now echoed like a cruel taunt in the chambers of her memory. They never came back. Not that day, not the next, not ever. Just gone. Swallowed whole by the sprawling, indifferent wilderness, or something far more sinister that lurked just beyond the tree line. Today was the anniversary, the day the calendar flipped from missing to presumed, the day the world, for all its noise and busy demands, fell utterly silent for Sarah. The silence wasn't a comfort. It was a void, a bottomless pit that swallowed hope whole. Every year, on this day, she felt the phantom weight of Tommy's small hand in hers, the ghost of David's strong arm around her shoulders. Every year, the question, sharp and relentless, tore through her. What happened to them? And every year the silence answered only with its deafening, cruel indifference. The absence wasn't just a lack. It was a palpable presence, a suffocating blanket woven from unaddressed fears and unshed tears. It was the air she breathed, the space where her heart used to be. The old photograph, laminated and slightly faded from years of handling, lay on the coffee table. It was a shot from a summer picnic, taken just weeks before they vanished. David, 35 then, with his easy smile and a slight crinkle around his eyes, holding Tommy, a cherubic 8-year-old with a gap-toothed grin and a mop of sandy hair. Beside it sat another image, a professional shot of their blue 1978 Chevy Suburban, shiny and new-looking, before time and the elements had taken their toll. These were the ghosts Sarah offered to the world, year after year, a desperate plea broadcast across local airwaves. It was an expensive ritual, one she'd stubbornly maintained even when her savings dwindled, even when well-meaning friends suggested it was time to move on, to accept. Accept what? A gaping wound that refused to heal? A narrative that simply ended mid-sentence? No. For Sarah, this annual broadcast wasn't just a desperate act of hope. It was a defiant shout into the void, a refusal to let them be forgotten. It was her way of keeping their memory alive, a flickering candle in the encroaching darkness. She adjusted the old rabbit-eared antenna on the television, a relic in an age of cable and satellites, convinced it made the signal stronger, clearer. Every year she went through the motions with the meticulousness born of desperation. The phone call to the station, the familiar voice on the other end, the confirmation of the time slot, the agonizing wait. She'd learned the exact moment to switch on the news, the precise interval between the commercials and the local interest segment where her plea would run. Her breath hitched as the local news jingle faded, replaced by the familiar face of Brenda Maxwell, the evening anchor. Brenda's voice, calm and sympathetic, began the segment. Sarah leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, her eyes fixed on the screen, a silent prayer forming on her lips. Please, someone, just one person. She knew the odds were astronomical, the chance of a breakthrough after so long, practically zero. But hope, that cruel, tenacious beast, refused to die. It clawed its way back, year after year, whispering promises of a miracle, urging her to keep the faith. And so, Sarah would wait. She would wait, and she would watch, caught in the relentless cycle of a hope that defied logic, fueled by a love that refused to surrender. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Tony Moretti's auto salvage, baking the metal carcasses of forgotten vehicles until the very air shimmered above them. The scent of rust, oil, and dust hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume to Tony, who had spent the better part of his life amidst the organized chaos of his junkyard. Today was no different, as a fresh batch of scrap had just been delivered, a sprawling metallic tide waiting to be processed. Tony, a man whose hands were permanently stained with grease, and whose face was a road map of sun-weathered lines, walked the rows, his keen eye assessing the hall. His gaze snagged on a particular vehicle, half buried under a heap of twisted steel, a severely mangled but still recognizable blue 1978 Chevy Suburban. Its once vibrant paint was dulled by years of exposure, and its frame was contorted into an impossible shape, as if it had been crumpled by a giant's fist. It was destined for the crusher, another anonymous casualty of time and accidents, soon to be reduced to a dense cube of metal. But as Tony circled the wreck, a flicker of something out of place caught his eye. Deep within the cavernous, crushed passenger compartment, where the dashboard had imploded inwards like a collapsing cave, something was lodged. It wasn't the usual debris, shattered glass, torn upholstery, or stray bits of plastic. This was different. It was dark, a rectangular shape, seemingly embedded in the twisted metal and cracked plastic of the dash. A prickle of unease, a sensation rare for a man accustomed to the grim realities of his profession, ran down Tony's spine. He paused, his boot nudging a loose piece of chrome, and peered closer. The object, whatever it was a defiant anomaly in the uniform destruction. It seemed almost deliberately hidden, or perhaps simply trapped by the sheer force of the impact. Curiosity, a powerful and ancient human drive, wrestled with the pragmatic urge to simply move on. He had a schedule to keep, and hundreds of tons of metal to sort. But something about this particular wreck, and that small, dark shape within it, compelled him to stay. A silent, unspoken story seemed to cling to the twisted frame, demanding a closer look. And Tony, against his better judgment, found himself leaning in, his breath held, ready to uncover what this forgotten wreckage might reveal. The afternoon sun, still high and relentless, glinted off the twisted metal as Tony leveraged a crowbar into the mangled dashboard. Rust flaked and plastic groaned under the pressure. With a final resonant clunk, a section of the console broke free, tumbling downwards. And there it was, no longer hidden, resting precariously in the exposed cavity. Tony reached in, his fingers calloused and strong, closing around the object. It was a notebook, small and unassuming, bound in dark, worn leather, the kind you might keep in a glove compartment for jotting down directions or mileage. Its surface was grimy, speckled with dust and bits of what looked like dried mud, but otherwise it was remarkably intact. The soft leather, however, felt oddly personal beneath his fingertips, a stark contrast to the cold, impersonal steel of the wreck. He pulled it out, turning it over in his hand. No brand name, no flashy design. just a simple, functional notebook. He ran a thumb over the cover, the leather softened by years of handling. Then his eyes, accustomed to deciphering the cryptic markings on engine blocks and VIN plates, caught a faint, almost erased name embossed on the bottom right corner, David Wilson. The name struck him with a strange, unfamiliar jolt. It wasn't the name of anyone he knew, or anyone connected to the salvage yard's usual clientele. It belonged to no one in this forsaken landscape of metal and memory. A tremor of something akin to curiosity, mixed with a deeper, more unsettling feeling, stirred within him. This wasn't just a piece of debris. It was a remnant of a life, a whisper from the past that had, against all odds, survived the crushing embrace of the junkyard. Carefully, Tony opened the notebook. The pages were yellowed and brittle, some stuck together, but the handwriting was clear, if a little hurried. Dates, mileage readings, gas prices, typical travel notes. But then, deeper within, he found a page filled with more personal scribbles, fishing spots, a list of gear, and finally, a crumpled, folded sheet of paper tucked between two pages. He smoothed it out. It was a torn scrap, clearly old, with a hand-scrawled address. Fort Towani, Willow Creek Lane, Reno, NV. And a phone number, faded but still legible. Reno, Nevada, a world away from the scorching Arizona desert. A cold dread began to creep through Tony. This wasn't just an old notebook. This was a piece of someone's life, a life that had, for 16 long years, been as lost and forgotten as the crushed Suburban now before him. The past, in all its stark, undeniable reality, had just slammed into the present, carried by the unlikely currents of a junkyard delivery. The small, crumpled piece of paper with the Reno address lay on Tony's workbench, a stark white against the oil stains and metal filings. He'd cleaned up for the day, the last of the junkyard crew gone, leaving him alone, with the ghosts of forgotten automobiles and the unsettling presence of that blue Suburban. He'd tried to shake it off, to dismiss the notebook as just another curiosity, but David Wilson's name and that Reno address gnawed at him. He was a man of the earth, of tangible things, not mysteries. Yet this felt like one. He picked up his rotary phone, its heavy plastic a relic from another era. His thumb hovered over the dial. What if it was a dead end? What if the family had moved on, changed their number, or worse, found closure in a way he couldn't even imagine? What right did he have to stir up old pain, to yank a family back into a nightmare, however long ago? He thought of the wrecked Suburban, the way it had been twisted, the force it must have taken. And then he thought of David Wilson's name, etched on the notebook, a silent plea across the years. Finally, with a deep breath that tasted of metal and dust, Tony dialed. The clicks and whirs of the old phone echoed in the quiet office. 1 ring, 2, 3, each one stretching, tightening the coil of tension in his gut. Just as he was about to hang up, a woman's voice, hesitant and a little weary, answered. "Hello?" Tony swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Yes, hello. My name's Tony Moretti. I own an auto salvage yard down in Arizona. I think I might have something that belongs to you." A beat of silence. On the other end, Sarah's hand tightened around the receiver. Her mind, perpetually vigilant, immediately registered the unusual nature of the call. Arizona? A salvage yard. Her heart, which had just begun its annual aching throb, suddenly hammered against her ribs. She'd received hundreds of calls over the years. False leads, cruel hoaxes, well-meaning but misguided tips. Her voice, brittle with years of disappointment, was laced with an almost imperceptible edge of suspicion. "I'm sorry, Mr. Moretti. I think you have the wrong number," she said, already moving to disconnect. It was safer to assume the worst, to protect herself from another crushing wave of false hope. "Wait, please," Tony interjected, his voice rising slightly in urgency. "Is this the Wilson residence? Sarah Wilson?" Sarah froze. How did he know her name? Her address? A sliver of doubt, a dangerous spark, ignited in the darkness of her despair. She gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. "This is Sarah Wilson. What is this about?" she demanded, her voice now sharper, a defensive wall going up. "Ma'am, I found something. In a car. A blue 1978 Chevy Suburban. And inside, a notebook with the name David Wilson on it. And your address." Tony spoke quickly, trying to convey the gravity of his discovery without sounding like a lunatic. The words hung in the air, connecting two distant, disparate realities. On Sarah's end, the world tilted. The blue Suburban. David's name. A notebook. 16 years of silence. Of a void suddenly filled with the faintest, most unbelievable echo. Her breath caught, a gas trapped somewhere between her lungs and her throat. The phone felt impossibly heavy in her hand. Her mind raced, rejecting, then grasping, then rejecting again the impossible implication. It was a cruel joke, it had to be. But the raw, unpolished sincerity in Tony's voice, the sheer specificity of his details. A blue Suburban," she whispered, the words barely audible, her voice cracking. The skepticism was still there, a shield, but beneath it, a tiny, fragile tendril of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years, began to unfurl. Hope. Dangerous, terrifying, utterly captivating hope. The line hummed with the electric tension of two strangers, bound by a car, a notebook, and the unbearable weight of 16 missing years. The drive from Reno to the Arizona desert was a long, arduous ribbon of highway, stretching across vast, indifferent landscapes. Sarah sat in the passenger seat of her brother John's aging but reliable Ford sedan, the dusty miles blurring outside the window. John, her younger brother by 5 years, was a quiet, steady presence. He'd dropped everything the moment Sarah's shaky, breathless call had reached him, his calm demeanor a solid anchor in the storm of her escalating emotions. He knew better than to offer platitudes or false comfort. He simply offered his time, his car, and his unwavering support. Each mile swallowed felt less like a journey towards an answer and more like a pilgrimage into the heart of a hope. Sarah hadn't dared to entertain in years. It was a terrifying, exhilarating sensation, like standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure if the next step would lead to solid ground or an endless fall. Her mind, usually a barren landscape of what-ifs and unanswerable questions, was now a maelstrom of memories. She saw David's easy grin, heard Tommy's infectious giggle. She remembered the warmth of David's hand in hers, the proud way Tommy would show off a particularly impressive rock or an awkwardly tied fishing knot. John, sensing her silent turmoil, kept the radio low, occasionally glancing over, his jaw tight. He'd seen Sarah through the initial frantic searches, the slow, agonizing fade of hope, the crushing weight of public sympathy, turning to quiet pity. He knew the cost of this desperate journey, the risk of reopening wounds that had barely scabbed over. But he also knew his sister, and he recognized the fragile, urgent flame that had been reignited within her. The landscape outside transformed subtly, The cool, pine-scented air of the Sierras gave way to the dry, scrubby plains of Nevada, which in turn yielded to the stark, sun-baked beauty of Arizona. The air grew thicker, hotter, carrying the faint, metallic scent of the desert. With each mile, Sarah felt a strange combination of dread and exhilaration. Was this a fool's errand? A mirage of hope in a desert of despair? Or was this the long, winding road that would finally lead her to the truth, to an end, to the suffocating silence that had defined her life for 16 years? The setting sun cast long, dramatic shadows across the red earth, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a fitting backdrop for a journey into the unknown, a passage from the shadow of absence to the daunting possibility of revelation. The Arizona sun, now directly overhead, beat down with an oppressive intensity as Sarah and John arrived at Tony Moretti's auto salvage. The air was thick with the metallic tang of rust and the fine dust that rose from the sprawling metallic graveyard. Tony, looking more serious than on the phone, met them at the entrance, his eyes scanning Sarah's face with a mix of apprehension and genuine sympathy. "Mrs. Wilson," he said, extending a grease-stained hand. "Tony Moretti, thanks for coming." Sarah nodded, her gaze already sweeping past him, searching, desperate. "The car?" she managed, her voice tight. Tony gestured with his chin towards the section of the yard, leading them through narrow aisles of crushed vehicles, their painted shells gleaming dully under the harsh light. And then Sarah saw it. Even in its mangled, unrecognizable state, twisted and compacted, she knew it. The faded blue, the particular curve of the remaining fender. A flash of chrome that had once been the trim of the tailgate. It was their blue 1978 Chevy Suburban. A sharp physical pain shot through her, a visceral punch to the gut. It was really here, a piece of her lost life, undeniably present, yet utterly destroyed. "Oh, David," she whispered, her hand involuntarily flying to her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. John put a steadying hand on her back, his own face grim. Tony allowed them a moment, then explained. "It was part of a haul brought in last week. Came from an auction, a lot of old wrecks from all over the country. No records on where exactly it originated, just that it was designated for scrap." He then explained the notebook, detailing where he'd found it, the name, the address. John, ever the pragmatic one, stepped forward. "Have you called the police, Mr. Moretti?" "Already did, soon as I realized what I had," Tony confirmed. "They're on their way. Local sheriff's department. Small town. So they're usually pretty good about getting here fast when something unusual comes up." Within minutes, a dusty sheriff's cruiser pulled into the yard. Sheriff Miller, a grizzled man with a no-nonsense air, listened intently as Tony recounted his discovery. He then turned to Sarah and John, his expression softening slightly. "Mrs. Wilson, I understand this is incredibly difficult. We'll do everything we can." The scene that followed was a strange blend of professional investigation and raw personal grief. Sheriff Miller and his deputies, with grim efficiency, began to examine the Suburban. They methodically searched every crevice, every crumpled corner, their flashlights probing the dark recesses. Sarah and John stood by, a safe distance away, their hope and dread warring within them. Every glance from a deputy, every hushed word, was scrutinized. Hours later, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery hues, Sheriff Miller approached them, his expression sober. "Mrs. Wilson, we've conducted a thorough preliminary search. There are no signs of a struggle, no blood, no human remains." His voice was gentle, but the words were a hammer blow, yet also a fragile gift. No remains. It meant they weren't in the car. Then his gaze flickered to Tony. "Mr. Moretti mentioned something else he found." Tony nodded, leading the sheriff to the spot where he'd found the notebook. "Underneath the driver's seat," he explained, pointing to a cleverly concealed latch. "Looks like a custom-built compartment. Almost impossible to spot unless you knew it was there." Sheriff Miller knelt, his gloved hand reaching into the dark cavity. He pulled out a small metallic box, dusty but surprisingly intact. "A hidden compartment," he mused, a flicker of professional interest in his eyes. "Well, Mrs. Wilson, this changes things." Sarah stared at the box, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. No bodies. A hidden compartment. The absence suddenly felt different. It was no longer a blank page, but a complex, unwritten story waiting to be revealed. The devastating reality of the crushed car was still there. But now, a fragile, impossible thought began to take root in the wreckage of her grief. If they weren't in the car, then maybe, just maybe, the possibility, however faint, was a lifeline in an ocean of despair. Sheriff Miller's gloved hands worked with practiced precision, prying open the small metallic box discovered in the Suburban's hidden compartment. Sarah and John leaned in, their breathing shallow, the dust motes dancing in the beams of the sheriff's flashlight. The anticipation in the hot desert air was almost suffocating. Money? Jewels? Something to explain an unexpected flight? But what lay within was far more profound. The sheriff first pulled out a small stack of children's drawings, folded carefully. Sarah gasped, a raw, choked sound. They were undeniably Tommy's. A lopsided stick figure of a man with a fishing rod, a bright blue sun, a smiling fish, a crude drawing of their old house, with a family of stick figures holding hands in front of it. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, hot and immediate. These weren't just drawings. They were fragments of a life, a testament to Tommy's innocent joy, preserved against all odds. He had drawn these. He had been there. He had existed beyond the realm of missing. Beneath the drawings, tucked away as if it were the most precious item, was a single aged envelope. It was addressed to "My dearest Sarah," in David's familiar, slightly slanting handwriting. The paper was yellowed and brittle with time, but otherwise perfectly preserved within the protective box. Sheriff Miller, sensing the immense personal weight of the moment, carefully handed the envelope to Sarah. Her fingers trembled as she took it, the paper crackling faintly under her touch. This was it, the direct communication she had yearned for, prayed for, despaired over, for 16 long years. She pulled out the single sheet of paper inside, her eyes devouring David's script. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then things have gone sideways, and I haven't been able to make it home. I'm so sorry, more sorry than words can say. I tried to protect you both, to keep you out of this, but it's gotten bigger than I ever imagined." Sarah's breath hitched. "Bigger than I imagined?" "I stumbled onto something, Sarah. Something big. Some very dangerous people are involved, and I've got proof. Evidence that could bring them down. But it also means I'm a target. They know I have it, and they know I'm going to turn it over." Sarah's eyes widened, a chilling realization dawning on her. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't some random disappearance. This was a deliberate act, a desperate flight. The image of the crushed Suburban, once a symbol of tragic finality, now morphed into something else entirely. A decoy, a calculated risk. "I had to get Tommy away. Had to. He's too young for this. I'm taking him to a place I know, a safe place, with someone I trust implicitly. Someone who will look after him no matter what happens to me. I need to lead them away, draw their attention to me, away from him." The words blurred through Sarah's tears, but the meaning was crystal clear, sharper than any knife. David hadn't abandoned them. He hadn't vanished by chance. He had made a choice, a desperate, heroic choice to protect their son. He had become a shield. The car wasn't just a wreck. It was a testament to David's last desperate gamble. "Don't look for me, Sarah. If they find me, they'll find him. Just know I loved you. I love you both more than life itself. And I will do anything, to keep Tommy safe." The letter ended there, abruptly, a testament to the urgency with which it had been written. Sarah clutched the letter to her chest, her body shaking with a profound mix of grief and a terrifying, exhilarating new understanding. David hadn't disappeared. He had vanished on purpose. He had sacrificed himself. And if he had taken Tommy to a safe place, then Tommy could still be out there. The vast empty void of missing had just been replaced by a chilling new reality, a deliberate, dangerous flight, and the faint but unmistakable whisper of hope. The revelation of David's letter, of his deliberate, desperate act, ripped open Sarah's world, tearing down the walls of passive grief and replacing them with a searing, urgent need for answers. Sheriff Miller, a man clearly moved by the unfolding drama, quickly proved to be the ally they desperately needed. He recognized the gravity of David's claims and the potential for a deeper, more sinister narrative than a simple missing persons case. "This changes everything, Mrs. Wilson," Sheriff Miller repeated, his voice low and serious as they sat in his small, cluttered office the next morning. Maps of Nevada and Arizona were spread across his desk, highlighted with potential routes. If David had information on a cartel, that's a whole different ballgame. We'll need to coordinate with law enforcement in Nevada, but given the time that's passed, it won't be easy. John, ever the strategist, had already taken the initiative, making calls to his own contacts, former colleagues from his days in law enforcement. He knew the bureaucratic hurdles they would face, the skepticism that greeted cold cases, especially those with such an incredible twist. But for Sarah, a new, fierce resolve had ignited within her. She was no longer just a grieving widow. She was a mother on a mission. Their first step was to retrace the original route David and Tommy had planned, meticulously examining old maps, cross-referencing them with David's notebook entries. The sheriff's office provided access to old police reports from 1984, detailing the initial fruitless search efforts. They scoured the desolate stretches of highway, stopping at every small gas station, every roadside diner, every forgotten motel that might have existed back then. They interviewed reluctant octogenarians who might have owned those businesses, showing them faded photographs of David and Tommy, hoping for a flicker of recognition. "Did you see a blue Suburban back in '84? Sarah would ask, her voice hoarse from repeated questions. "A man and a little boy? Fishing gear?" Most shook their heads, their memories as faded as the photos. A few offered vague recollections, quickly dismissed as unhelpful. The desert was a vast, silent keeper of secrets. Beyond the physical search, they delved into David's past. Sarah recounted every detail she could remember about David's life leading up to 1984. His work, his friends, any unusual conversations, any new acquaintances, anything that might point to the dangerous people he mentioned in his letter. John reached out to David's former colleagues, his old fishing buddies, trying to piece together a puzzle from 16 years of silence. It was painstaking work, a slow, methodical crawl through the past, sifting through layers of forgotten time. Each dead end was a fresh sting. But the possibility of Tommy being alive, of David's heroic sacrifice, was a powerful, unyielding engine. They followed every lead, however tenuous, each small detail adding another piece to the fractured narrative. Sarah, who had once been paralyzed by grief, now moved with a focused energy, fueled by the terrifying yet exhilarating possibility that, somewhere out there, a part of her heart still beat. The path was long, shrouded in the dust of forgotten years, but for the first time in forever, Sarah felt she was finally walking towards something, rather than away from everything. The dusty winding roads of the Nevada mountains often led to solitude, and for some, to a life lived on the fringes. Deep within a forgotten canyon, miles from any paved road, lived Silas. He was an old man, gaunt and weathered, with eyes that held the wisdom of decades spent observing the subtle rhythms of the wilderness. For over 30 years, Silas had lived in a ramshackle cabin built from scavenged wood and corrugated metal, a self-imposed exile from a world he found too loud, too complicated, too false. People rarely sought him out, and he preferred it that way. But even in his isolation, the world had a way of seeping in. A week after Sarah and John's renewed efforts hit the local news, a small blurb, tucked away after a feature on the high school football team, a hunter, lost and desperate for directions, stumbled upon Silas's cabin. He mentioned the old missing persons case, the one that had just been reopened, a detail he'd picked up from a dusty newspaper he'd found wrapped around his lunch. The words Blue Suburban, Man and Boy, and 1984 snagged something deep in Silas's memory, a dormant thread that suddenly pulsed with a strange, unsettling energy. He listened, his face impassive, offering the hunter terse directions, but his mind had already retreated. He remembered them clearly. It was a crisp autumn day in 1984, much like the one now. He'd been checking his traps when he saw the Blue Suburban. It was pulled off a little-used logging road, tucked almost out of sight. A man, early 30s, with a worried look, and a small boy, quiet, wide-eyed, clutching a worn teddy bear. They'd looked hunted, not lost. They were hiding. Silas, a man who generally kept to himself, had felt a rare stir of empathy. The man, David, had introduced himself, his voice low, his eyes constantly scanning the tree line. He said they were having trouble that involved bad men who were following them. He needed to create a diversion, draw the heat away. And then David had done something truly extraordinary. Something that had haunted Silas for 16 years. He'd looked the old hermit straight in the eye, his gaze intense, desperate, and held out a small, crumpled piece of paper. If something happens to me, David had rasped, please, for my son, take Tommy here. He'd given a name, Eleanor Vance, and an address, 12 Elm Street, Willow Creek, California. She's my aunt. She'll know what to do. Tell her David sent you. Tell her I needed to make sure Tommy was safe. Silas, a man who avoided all entanglement, had felt a profound, unexpected responsibility settle upon him. He'd watched as David had embraced Tommy, a desperate final hug, before leading him away from the car, deeper into the forest, towards a barely visible, disused trail. David had then returned to the Suburban, started it, and driven deliberately, almost defiantly, towards the main highway, as if daring pursuit. Moments later, Silas had heard the faint rumble of another vehicle following. The memory had been a heavy burden, a secret he'd kept buried, fearful of involvement, fearful of retribution. But now, with the news of the reopened case, with the images of David and Tommy being broadcast, a different kind of burden weighed on him. The burden of knowing, the burden of silence. He pushed himself up from his rough wooden chair, the joints in his knees creaking. It was a long walk, a difficult walk for an old man, but there was a dusty, rarely used fire road that eventually led to a small, isolated general store. It was time. After 16 years, it was time to break his silence. The quiet whisper of a father's desperate plea, carried on the mountain winds for so long, was finally ready to be heard. The directions given by Silas, the old hermit, had been precise, etched into his memory over 16 years. They led Sarah, John, and a quiet, efficient Sheriff Miller on a journey that diverged from the main highways, winding through a patchwork of forgotten state routes and county roads. The landscape shifted from the stark, dramatic beauty of the Nevada desert to the greener, gentler rolling hills of central California, eventually bringing them to a small, unassuming town called Willow Creek. It was the kind of place you drove through without noticing, a cluster of houses and a single general store, seemingly untouched by the passage of time. The address, 12 Elm Street, led them to a modest two-story house with a porch swing and a meticulously kept flower garden. It was a home that radiated quiet comfort, a stark contrast to the trauma and upheaval that had led them here. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, desperate rhythm. This was it. This was the place. The years of agonizing uncertainty, the crushing weight of unanswered prayers, all boiled down to this single moment, this unassuming doorstep. Sheriff Miller, sensing the raw emotion radiating from Sarah, stepped forward and knocked. The sound was surprisingly loud in the stillness of the afternoon. After a moment, the front door creaked open, revealing an elderly woman with kind, tired eyes and hair pulled back in a neat bun. This had to be Eleanor Vance, David's aunt. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but with a hint of cautious curiosity. "Mrs. Vance," Sheriff Miller began, his voice calm and professional. "My name is Sheriff Miller. We're here with Mrs. Sarah Wilson. We're investigating a very old missing persons case that may involve your nephew, David Wilson." Eleanor Vance's eyes, already wary, widened imperceptibly at the mention of David's name. She glanced at Sarah, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. Recognition? Fear? Then her gaze softened, a hint of sorrow mingling with surprise. She looked at John, then back at Sarah. "Please come in," she said, her voice barely a whisper, stepping aside to let them enter. The living room was cozy, filled with comfortable worn furniture and the scent of old books and dried potpourri. And then Sarah saw him. Standing by a bookcase, a tall, slender man in his mid-20s, his back to them. He was turning from looking at a photograph on the shelf, and as he turned, his eyes, the same shade of hazel as David's, met Sarah's. It was a shock that hit her with the force of a physical blow. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of his jaw, the way his hair fell across his forehead, even the slight tilt of his head. It was Tommy. Her Tommy, but grown. Not the 8-year-old boy frozen in time in her memories, but a man. "Tommy?" Sarah gasped, the name a raw, broken sound, pulled from the deepest part of her soul. The man froze, his eyes initially filled with mild curiosity, now widened in astonishment, then a flicker of confusion, and finally, a deep, dawning recognition. He took a hesitant step back, his gaze fixed on Sarah, a mixture of disbelief and a profound, aching yearning in his eyes. He didn't say anything, but his lips parted slightly, as if to speak, then closed. Eleanor Vance stepped forward, her hand gently touching the young man's arm. "Lucas," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "this is Sarah, your mother." Lucas, not Tommy. The name felt alien, yet it was undeniably him. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she took a tentative step forward, her arms outstretched, a silent invitation. And then, with a choked sob that tore through the quiet room, he broke. "Mom?" he whispered, the name a question, a plea, and a miracle all at once. He was in her arms in an instant, a man now, but to her still her little boy. She held him fiercely, burying her face in his shoulder, inhaling the scent of him, a scent she hadn't realized she'd been aching for 16 long years. John watched, tears openly streaming down his own face, a hand over his mouth. Sheriff Miller, professional demeanor still intact, subtly turned away, giving them a semblance of privacy in this sacred, impossible moment. After a long, tearful embrace, Sarah pulled back slightly, her hands cupping his face, her eyes devouring every detail. "Tommy," she whispered again, letting the true name settle around him. He nodded, his own eyes brimming. "They called me Lucas here," he explained, his voice rough with emotion. "Aunt Eleanor, she told me Dad died. Said that you had to go away, that you couldn't keep me safe." The words were laced with a lifetime of pain, of perceived abandonment. "No," Sarah cried, shaking her head vehemently. "Never. Your father. He saved you. He told me in a letter. He led them away, Tommy. He told me to never look for him because it would put you in danger. He left you here because he trusted Aunt Eleanor." Tommy, now Lucas, blinked, a new wave of emotion washing over his face. Confusion, then a profound, aching understanding. He said he had to draw them away. He said he'd find me when it was safe. His voice trailed off, the weight of his father's sacrifice, the truth of his absence, finally settling upon him. "He told me to wait. He said I would be safe here. He said he would always come back." The quiet dignity of his words, the unwavering faith he'd held on to for 16 years, broke Sarah's heart anew, even as it filled it with an agonizing, impossible joy. He had waited. All this time, he had waited. The initial euphoria of the reunion slowly gave way to a deeper, more profound conversation, as Sarah and Tommy, now Lucas, sat in Eleanor Vance's quiet living room. Eleanor, a woman who had carried the weight of this secret for years, watched them with a mix of relief and sorrow. John, ever the quiet observer, listened intently, his hand resting reassuringly on Sarah's shoulder. "He told me to wait," Tommy began, his voice still raw with emotion, but now tinged with a dawning understanding. "He said he had to draw them away, said it was the only way to keep me safe." He looked at Sarah, then at Eleanor. "He never said who them were, just that they were bad men, and that he'd seen something he shouldn't have." Eleanor, her voice raspy with emotion, picked up the narrative. "David called me a few days before he vanished. He sounded terrified. He told me he'd been working on a construction project, a big one, out near the Mexican border. He saw something, bodies being buried, late at night. He tried to ignore it, but then he saw the same men moving large shipments of drugs hidden in construction materials." Sarah's blood ran cold. Drugs, bodies. This was far more sinister than she had ever imagined. "He couldn't just turn a blind eye," Eleanor continued, her gaze firm. "David was always a man of principle. He started gathering evidence, small things at first, just observations. But he inadvertently got too close. He saw a face, recognized a local low-level enforcer, and they knew he had seen them. They knew he was a witness." Tommy picked up the story, the memories resurfacing with startling clarity. "He was supposed to testify. He told me that. He said he had a meeting with the authorities, But then he said he couldn't risk it. Not with me. He was so scared for me, Mom. He said they'd come after me if he went to the police directly. He explained the desperate, frantic hours leading up to their disappearance. We drove for days, it felt like. He was constantly looking over his shoulder. He kept saying we needed to shake them. He tried to make it an adventure for me. But I knew. Even at 8, I knew something was terribly wrong. He kept saying, "Just a little further, buddy, then we'll be safe." He chose this place, Eleanor added softly, gesturing around her cozy home. My address was a fallback, a place David trusted if things went really wrong. He knew I wouldn't ask questions. He knew I would protect Tommy above all else. Tommy recounted the final moments before his father's last selfless act. We stopped here, just off that old logging road. He had packed me a small bag with some clothes and my teddy bear. He told me he was going to go on ahead and find us a better fishing spot, that he'd be right back. But his eyes told a different story. He hugged me so tight, Mom. So tight. He said, "Be a good boy, Tommy, and know that I love you more than anything in the world. Always remember that." A tear escaped Tommy's eye, tracing a clean path down his cheek. And then he told Aunt Eleanor something. He said, "If I don't come back, tell him I did this for him. Tell him I loved him and you, Sarah, more than life itself. And tell him to live a full life. Don't let this define him." Eleanor nodded, her own eyes moist. He got back in the Suburban, and he drove it away, and deliberately, slowly. We saw another car, a dark sedan, follow him within minutes. David was bait. He sacrificed himself to draw them away, to ensure his son's safety. The full weight of David's sacrifice settled over the room, a profound silence broken only by the soft sounds of their breathing. He hadn't simply vanished. He had orchestrated his own disappearance, staged the wreck of the Suburban as a decoy, and led his pursuers away from his son into an unknown fate. His love for Tommy and for Sarah had been a shield, a desperate, heroic act of ultimate protection. The story of David Wilson, once defined by absence, was now complete, etched in the heroic lines of a father's unwavering love. The drive back to Reno was entirely different from the journey to Arizona. The landscape still rolled past, but now it was seen through eyes that held not just hope, but a fragile, burgeoning sense of peace. Sarah sat beside Tommy, his hand occasionally finding hers, a silent affirmation of their shared reality. John drove, a quiet smile playing on his lips, the tension that had gripped him for 16 years finally beginning to ease. The initial days back in Reno were a whirlwind of emotion, adjustment, and the slow, delicate process of rebuilding a shattered world. For Sarah, it was a constant balancing act between the joy of having her son back and the profound grief for David, whose heroic sacrifice had made this reunion possible. She found herself reaching for the phone to tell him, only to remember, with a fresh pang of loss, that he wouldn't answer. For Tommy, now 24, the adjustment was even more complex. He had a lifetime of memories under the name Lucas, a life lived in the quiet, unassuming shadow of Willow Creek, under Eleanor Vance's loving but protective care. He'd learned a trade, worked odd jobs, built a quiet life. But now, his identity was fractured, his past irrevocably altered. He was Tommy Wilson, David's son, Sarah's son, and the weight of that truth was both liberating and daunting. He spent hours poring over old photo albums Sarah had kept, images of David frozen in time. He asked 1,000 questions, each one a thread woven into the tapestry of a father he barely remembered, but now understood so profoundly. What was Dad's favorite food? Did he really hate doing dishes? What did he laugh at most? Sarah answered each one patiently, her voice thick with love and bittersweet memories, painting a portrait of the man who had loved them enough to disappear. The conversations were difficult, often ending in tears, but they were necessary. Tommy needed to understand the man who had shaped his destiny from afar. Sarah needed to share the David she knew, the one who had been stolen from them, but whose spirit lived on in their son. They visited David's grave, a quiet ceremony in a small Reno cemetery, a belated goodbye, and a heartfelt thank you. Sarah brought flowers. Tommy brought a small, smooth river stone, a memory of the fishing trips that had defined their last days together. The cartel David had exposed had been a shadow, too deeply entrenched and too long ago for easy justice. Sheriff Miller had shared David's letter with the Nevada authorities, and while the case was officially reopened, the trail was cold, and the men David had seen had likely vanished or met their own ends. But for Sarah and Tommy, justice wasn't about arrests or convictions. It was about the truth and the chance to rebuild their lives. The road to healing would be long, filled with the echoes of the past and the challenges of a future that felt both new and familiar. There would be therapy, difficult conversations, and moments of profound sadness. But now they would walk it together. Sarah had her son back, a living testament to David's enduring love. And Tommy, no longer lost, no longer waiting, finally had his mother, and the truth of his father's unwavering devotion. As the seasons changed and the Reno light grew softer, a new, gentle rhythm began to emerge in the Wilson home, a symphony of quiet hope, resilient love, and the quiet promise of a future, finally in focus.